Sue, we just want to hear from you. Maybe introduce yourself, give your name, who you are, how you fit in. So a little intro,
Okay.
assuming someone doesn't know who you are that's watching this. And then we want to talk about your history in terms of like you as a person and what's brought you to having like a caring heart for others. As you have, because there's been a number of times in your life that's sort of been more or less at the forefront of things that you've done globally,
Yes.
big picture wise. So we could go through those, your childhood and your adolescence time abroad with Peace Corps.
Oh my gosh, forgot all of that. So are you going to ask me questions, or you just want me to talk? Or?
No, just start talking. Start by introducing yourself.
And you'll intervene and
Yeah.
all of that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if we feel like if we come up with a question or something, while you're talking, we'll let a natural,
Love.
where there's a natural place to insert it, we'll do that.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm Dr. Sue Brown. I'm the co-creator of Neurooptimal Neurofeedback and a founder of Zengar Institute.
So can you take us back to where you realized that you actually started caring about the well-being of people?
Oh.
Tell us about your childhood and where you come from, and let's start there.
Okay, yes. I've wanted to help other people since a very early age, certainly by the age of 5. I remember when I was very young, once I started getting pocket money, actually going and buying ointments and bandages and things like that, and I would dress the wounds of my friends. And sometimes I charged them threepence to do that. But mainly I really wanted to help people. I think I always wanted to be a nurse. It was not an option in my family for me to be a physician. As a girl, I was told that it would be a waste to educate me. You'll just get married and that would be it. And of course I've spent my whole life working. I've never not worked really. I was an army brat, so we moved a lot when I was young. My father was in the British Army, in sort of a special forces unit. And we moved to Jamaica when I was very young. So I have very early recollections of walking down a long, long, long road to get all my vaccinations before going to Jamaica. And once we got to Jamaica when I was 3, I very quickly learned to swim. I loved being in the water, and that was quite a theme through my life. I was a competitive swimmer later. So I think my young childhood was basically spent trying to integrate very quickly into environments, into new schools, make new friends. That really was survival for me. And that became relevant later with Neurooptimal because I wanted to make sure we created a community for our Neurooptimal users so they had somewhere that they belonged. And I think that all stems back to my challenges with belonging anywhere. I went to about 13 schools in my young life. So I wanted to train as a nurse, but I was living fairly close to London at the time, and I knew that if I didn't get away from my parents, it would be very hard to be a nurse in London and to sort of separate from them. So I decided I wanted to do voluntary service overseas, VSO, and I applied for that and was accepted and went to the Solomon Islands for a year. So I was a volunteer for a year, virtually unpaid except for your keep, and taught on this isolated mission station. I was always most interested in the medical stuff. When I first went there, I was based in the hospital, and I would find myself in the operating room, leaning on the operating table, watching the surgeries. And it was just a sort of a room with mosquito meshing as the windows. And when they did surgeries on a Tuesday, all the local people would come and just stare in the window and watch. It was interesting because the sterilization of all the instruments was done by heating a large 44-gallon kerosene drum with a Bunsen burner. And they would sterilize instruments in that laborious way. So emergency appendectomies and all of that were done. The families of the patients would move in under the bed. So the bed was basically a wooden form with a mat that they would sleep on, and the family would move in underneath and sit in that little space. And then you'd send them off home, and then you'd tell them in pidgin English, come back when the moon, is in this phase. We want to see you again. I was actually, before I went to the Solomon Islands, I was given a box of goodies, which included books and things that I could take with me, but a lot of medical supplies, sutures, instruments and such. I was not trained in any way, well, not much, but I was able to sort of help some of the local people sew up their toes and things. I say that I wasn't trained, but actually at a very early age, certainly by 14, I had done a thing in England called St. John's Ambulance, which is sort of learning first aid, basically. And I went and volunteered at the local hospital. So I was in hospitals from the age of 14, and then later as a trainee nurse, and qualified nurse, of course.
So was there anything what was the driving force behind your going to Solomon Islands? I mean, you mentioned kind of getting away from your folks as one of them. Was there any other thing that inspired you? Or did anything there inspire you also? Anything more you could touch on?
VSO was very well looked upon in Britain. It was difficult to get into. So it was a good thing maybe for a CV. But I think, again, it was all part of wanting to help people. It just fit in with that. It was not a paid position. And I certainly never considered money. There were many people in my young life who said to me, nursing, there's no money in nursing. And I just didn't care. It was irrelevant. So money has not been a motivating factor, except when I didn't have enough of it. And then it was a sort of stress to make ends meet, because as the two of you know, I was a student for a very long time while raising two small children, which are you, Samantha, and Alex.
Did you do VSO knowing that you wanted to be a nurse and helping people in that way, or did VSO help you figure that out?
No, I definitely always wanted to be a nurse from very young. I did VSO, I had already been accepted at Bart's Hospital in London, which is a very, very old hospital. It's the oldest hospital in the world. It was founded in 1123. So shortly after I left, it celebrated its 850th anniversary. It's been around for a very long time. So it was a very wonderful institution. They accepted me, and then I decided I wanted to do VSO first. I wanted to do something else, go to another culture. So they deferred my acceptance for a year.
Did you have any heartwarming stories about VSO, or anything that you think impacted you long term? And at the end, did you feel a relief coming back? Were you pleased? Were you happy and satisfied with what you've done? Did it leave some other sense? Did it leave you feeling in some other way?
Yes, at first when I went, I was assigned to a hospital in Honiara. and I really enjoyed that. But then after, or shortly before Christmas, they told me I was being reassigned to this mission station on an isolated island. When I went there, I was not given any religious upbringing at all, and I did find it difficult. And there was the assistant vice headmistress who seemed to take quite a dislike to me, I think. She asked me what church I was, and I said, well, Church of Scotland, because that's what I was baptized under. And then she asked me if I was this kind of church or this within that unit, and I think I said the wrong one. From that time on, she did not like me, and I wasn't really able to. Part of our duties was to conduct services, and I wasn't very skilled with that. So it was isolating. I had to sleep in the radio room. There wasn't a proper place for me there. We were teaching at sort of second level of high school, second year of high school. That was the extent of the education at the time. I did feel very isolated, and I have to say the day I left that island was the happiest day of my life, certainly until that point, and it's still one of the high points, flying up over and knowing that I didn't have to be there. So I suppose I wasn't very happy, but I was determined to not give in. I was not going to stop this early. I was going to see it through to the end. So I think I discovered my own determination, not that I ever questioned it, but to see something through that, wasn't very happy for me. So then when I came back, I wanted to do something as superficial as possible. So I went to the Lucy Clayton School of Modelling in London and sort of trained as a model just for fun, because I was back in September and waiting until November to start at Barts. So that was an interesting little interlude there. And I modelled for Day1Session2Sue actually for some years as a way of getting my hair done for free and getting some pay for doing some modelling gigs because we were so hard up from Barts. I mean, we were paid nothing.
That's interesting that you could fund your, the one side of your life, which is caring for others and nursing, by doing something as superficial as modeling.
Right.
Sort of like a Robin Hood.
I guess so, yes. I even went for an interview for the Playboy Club in London and got accepted, and then I didn't dare take it up.
Meaning as a waitress or
As a bunny, a Playboy bunny. So it's a waitressing job, basically,
Yeah.
in an interesting uniform, but there's no way I dared to
I saw that documentary.
to actually follow through on it. But after that, after the VSO thing, and having to function so, in an environment that I didn't feel really comfortable throughout my 18th year, by the time I reached Barts, which was a very tough training, it was easy peasy. Yeah, no problem at all.
Because you were able to overcome adversity with the VSO experience.
Yes.
And put everything else
Yes.
into great perspective.
Yeah, it did.
It turned out to be pretty good timing to have that at the beginning of your life.
Yes, it wasn't a bad thing at all. Yeah.
Anything to take from there? VSO or move on?
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay. So then you studied nursing. You were at Barts.
Yes, and the way we trained, it was before there were degree programs at that time.
Was Barts a university? Did they give
It's a
degrees?
university hospital. It's associated with Cambridge University. The medical students do their pre-med at Cambridge and then go to Barts. So it was very tough, but it was fun. It was intense. Obviously, I learned a lot. Very early on, at the end of my first year, I was put on night duty, and then I was in charge of my ward. And that was quite a lot of responsibility at the time. But I always did very well at it. Academically, it was very easy. We'd go for 1 month a year into what we call block, where you're just studying and you're off the wards. And it was very easy. It was almost too easy. I didn't find it mentally challenging in that way. But it was challenging on the floors. You're seeing life and death. I was seeing people my own age dying of leukemia. Very quickly, from diagnosis to death would be like 6 weeks. It was heartrending, and I saw difficult things, and so that also prepared me very well. About 5 years ago, I went back to London from Canada to train as a chef for something different to do, and I was definitely the one that could kill the crabs and things most easily because of my training. Everybody else was a bit squeamish about it all, but I said, oh, this is nothing compared with what I've had to do. Like, wham!
Do you think that did anything click in you at your time at Bart's, or was it sort of you knew what to expect, but when you're in it, it's different, and you just had to adapt and go from there?
I think
Was there anything that did it change you? Do you think?
I think it changed us all, and every nurse I ever knew, once they were a nurse, was trying to get out of nursing. It was just what you did because you were working terrible hours for terrible pay. It was very worthwhile. I mean, I remember many of my experiences, and this isn't probably the time to go through some of them. Very funny as well as, distressing, I guess. But I think we all just wanted to try to get out of nursing. What I enjoyed most was kind of technical nursing. So what I wanted to do afterwards was actually just be in the operating room, in the theatres, as it was called there. I wanted to come to Canada. I was interested in Canada, and I applied for a job as soon as I qualified, just to cook and clean for a summer with another girlfriend, a nurse, and came to Montreal, and that was to change my life. Actually, I had been to Montreal once before. During my nursing, I was selected to represent my hospital at the Student Nurses Association at the big international nursing conference in Montreal. So I visited Montreal and attended that conference and sort of fell in love with it. So I was eager to maybe come back after I had qualified, which I did. But I enjoyed most working in the operating room, which was very technical. It was very fast. It was very intense when it was intense, but then it was very relaxed when it was quiet. And you were just sort of packing instruments and,
Did working on the technical side remove a bit of the drama from the other aspect of nursing, do you think?
You probably saw less of the humanitarian suffering of it because the patients were asleep generally when I was working with them. So in that way, yes. I think physically, though, I knew I couldn't nurse all my life. I was aware that I wouldn't be able to do it when I was 50, for example. It was such hard work. And part of that motivated me to go back and study and get my various degrees, including my PhD in clinical psychology, so that I could do something that was a little less physically demanding. But I always worked with physically ill patients, so that medical knowledge I applied in psychology, and my specialty then was behavioral medicine.
And you did that because it was an interest, or it came to you naturally, or because you had the background, or
oddly enough, I mean, I had motivation to do a PhD. Well, at first it was a motivation to do a bachelor's. That seemed a far-off thing. So I entered a program that you could only enter. It was a nursing program, but you could only go into it if you were already a qualified nurse and practicing nurse in Montreal. So I did that, and during that course I did a class in, what was it, in personality or whatever it was, and I learned about sort of counselling, and I thought, I want to do that. I really want to do it, but I didn't know what it was. And then I had to sort of figure it out, what counselling was, and then I wanted to actually become a psychologist, which was, in the States, it's a scientist practitioner model. So you're trained as a scientist, but then you function as a practitioner, or you can. For a while I thought I wanted to go into research, into academic research, but my real love was working with clients and with patients. So that sort of passed briefly. I really just wanted to help people in some way. I think part of doing my PhD, I knew at the time that I wanted to do it so that I would have the credibility, so people would listen to what I had to say. I didn't know I was going to develop neuroptimal at that time, but I somehow knew it was important that I be listened to down the road, but I didn't know what it was. So I know that sounds a bit strange, but that was the motivating factor for doing the PhD. It wasn't really to get the body of knowledge that it afforded. It was more that I would be able to then go on to do whatever it was I was going to do.
Do you think you were driven to give some sort of message because early on it was expected that you wouldn't ever have one, that you were just meant to marry and live a quiet life?
I felt so constrained by that. I mean, I really felt constrained, and I remember feeling that sort of desperation because I knew it wasn't enough for me to do that. I just couldn't do it. I mean, I'd lived in so many varied environments when I was young. To stay in one place, I think it probably triggered an enjoyment of fairly varied environments. When I started studying, I realized I was good at it. And at the time I was raising 2 children, I was in a household and thinking, you know, nobody listens to me. And yet when I'm at the hospital, for example, where I also worked at the same time as studying, you know, I was in charge of the whole hospital, and if I said something, things got done, but not at home. So it was, my work has always kept me with my feet on the ground. And it's where I got my reward for what I could do. It was rewarding because I could do it well. And I got awards for it and discovered I was good at it.
So after your nursing time in Montreal, you looked at the clinical psychology program at Stony Brook.
I did. I decided I was going to apply to become a clinical psychologist, but meanwhile I would just send one application into Stony Brook this year, and then I would do a full application the next year for a number of different clinical psychology programs. It's very difficult to get in. The chances of getting in are very slim. When I applied, they would accept 8 people, and there were about 400 applicants. So I didn't think I was going to get in, and during the last 24 hours, I actually prepared a full application and got it sent down overnight and received, and just got it in sort of under the wire. And I got in. I mean, it was totally mind-blowing, took me completely by surprise. It's amusing in a way because at the time I wrote in my application that what I wanted to do was to change how medicine was practiced in the Western world. and bring it more in line with quantum physical thinking. Now that's a very conceited thing for somebody who's not even a physician to want to do, but looking back on that now, in a way, that's what we have done with Neuroptimal. And because Neuroptimal works, medicine can't be quite the way, the reductionistic way that we think that it is. The fact that what we do is so powerful shows that we haven't got the right handle on how medicine works. And the medical field is also changing its thinking. There are branches of energetic medicine and all these, less conventional ways of viewing medicine. But that's what I wanted to do. And I was very interested in time perception and how that affected your physical health, because it seemed that people with a very rushed sense of time, like type A, were actually dying younger. And that's something I was interested in studying. And actually, for my dissertation, I did produce a behavioral model of type A behavior and then tested out the physiological effects as they engaged in a rather challenging and frustrating task.
If only you could go back to that board, whoever accepted you, and show them what you've done. I'm sure they voted off as unlikely.
Unlikely, and yet they accepted me, so for some reason.
Well, probably
Yeah.
for many reasons. So then you achieved, you got your PhD actually at Stony Brook,
Yes,
and you worked there as a clinical psychologist, and you did clinical studies,
mm-hmm.
and had a private practice.
Maybe get her to just say all that?
Yeah, can we go through some of that?
Well, as part of my studies in psychology, I also had to work to support my two children, so I was working as a therapist. One of my degrees from McGill was in counselling psychology, so I was able to work with clients and patients. I also had done a stint at the Montreal General Hospital in the Behavioural Sciences Centre there, and worked as a therapist there for a while. So when I arrived at Stony Brook, I was already a relatively competent therapist, but I hadn't had all the theoretical background that Stony Brook would provide, because Stony Brook is the sort of behavioural bastion of psychology. And I particularly wanted to study behavioural psychology because that was most applicable for medically ill patients. Once I decided I didn't want to do academic research, however, and I was involved in a whole bunch of studies and have publications on those. Once I knew I wanted to work directly with patients, I then left Stony Brook and went into private practice in Port Jefferson, New York, and was in practice there for a good few years. And it was during that time, during my behavioral training, knowing I wanted to go into behavioral medicine, we did a lot of biofeedback. So we were working with patients with migraines, for instance, and doing training with them so they could learn to train their physiology and avoid migraines, hopefully. We did stress management for patients who had had an initial heart attack to prevent additional problems, intensive programming there and training them to manage stress more effectively. So from that biofeedback, which I did, I also continued doing that in my private practice. And at that time, I had heard about this new thing, neurofeedback, but I wasn't very interested in it because basically I had trained from the neck down, particular cardiovascular psychophysiology. I wasn't interested in anything from the neck up, and that's what I felt neurofeedback was. But then I discovered it could help things like depression. It was being used with ADD. and I became more interested in it. So at some point I attended a conference, a future health conference. Well, it was given by, these classes were given by the person who would organize the future health conferences, and he organized a 5-day conference on biofeedback, and then there was a day off, and then there was another 5-day conference for neurofeedback. So I signed up for both of these things and went through the biofeedback conference, and it was everything that I sort of knew and understood to be biofeedback. And then the neurofeedback conference was really, it changed my world, because one gentleman stood up and he was presenting how this patient who had had a motor vehicle accident 1 year before, he had not made a whole lot of progress since that time. And he said how he was able to train him to be able to reach forward, take a cup, and bring it to his lips. And this was a huge gain. And I remember, because there was an uproar from the floor of the audience, and somebody stood up and said, that can't be. If you're 1 year post-accident, you're never going to get changes like that. It's not possible. And the presenter sort of stood there and he said, well, the only other thing that we did that was different, we did some neurofeedback as well. Oh no, I'm sorry, it was in the biofeedback conference. So during the biofeedback conference, this gentleman stood up and gave these results. And that audience said, that's not possible. You can't get those changes 1 year post-accident. And that was like, oh my gosh, what happened here was he had received some neurofeedback. And that was mind-blowing to me, and a very significant moment. And what was odd was, okay, the audience just settled down and it went on as if nothing had happened. But I knew that was a significant difference. The addition of the neurofeedback changed dramatically, not just the amount of the results you could get, but the nature of the results. And that really intrigued me. So I went into the neurofeedback conference with great interest at that point and embarked on, I ended up buying a particular system, which then led me to Val, because he was the official teacher of that system. So I signed up for a class, which Val taught, and that's how I met him initially. And we were professional associates for several years before we got together as a couple.
What difference did you notice in your practice when you brought neurofeedback back to it?
What I found, because I had a clinical psychotherapy practice, and I loved doing psychotherapy, and I still do, but bit by bit, I realized that I could get the clients further in a shorter period of time if they were hooked up and doing neurofeedback rather than our talking. So it was a bit of a mix of the two at first. Later, it got even harder after we'd sort of developed our own system. I knew that I was just not giving them the best care unless I could offer them neurofeedback. And that was particularly true at that time when managed care was becoming the norm. So you might have 10 sessions to work with somebody. So if you really want to help them during 10 sessions, talk therapy can do so much, and there have been much more powerful talk therapy approaches that have developed since then, specifically to work with, short-term clientele. So that's improved a lot. But I knew that doing neurofeedback, they would get much, much further than if we sat and talked. So sometimes they would come in and say, oh, I need to talk today. And I would say, that's fine, but just let me hook you up, while we're talking, so that we're ready to go, if and when you're ready for it. And then we would start the session, and they'd be off. But yes, and what I found was, especially with clients I'd worked with over a long period of time, we would suddenly make these huge gains. It was like suddenly being on a diving board and getting that lift. It wasn't just a change in the amount of benefit somebody could get. It's a change in the whole quality and type of benefit you could get. Now, I wasn't a child expert at all, but you could see children, for example, becoming vocal when they had not been verbal at all, and nothing else had helped them. And they received care from all kinds of different practitioners and healthcare providers. If you do all of that while doing neurofeedback, a good quality neurofeedback, you get so much further. It's just a different animal. The results were just totally different. As a behavior therapist, I would spend time teaching people active muscular relaxation, then passive muscular relaxation, then breathing exercises. Then we would go out into difficult situations, learning to be very relaxed while you were in this challenging situation. But it was very laborious and piecemeal. And it became imperative to me to find a way to help people that didn't require as much effort, and that if they stopped practicing their techniques, they would just lose the skill and it was gone. It wouldn't last. And they would tell me, yes, I am better than I was when I first came to you. I am doing more. My life is better, but I'm still anxious. So it's like a battle the whole way. Once we started doing neurofeedback, the anxiety dropped. And you don't have to teach people all these other things, because once they're not anxious, they're going about their life in the way that they want to. It's irrelevant. They're not, there's nothing for them to have to learn at that point.
Were you teaching them tricks to deal with the anxiety, or was it about getting to the root of the anxiety? I would think with short-term patients, you have to look at a balance.
A behaviorist wouldn't get to the root of anything. They only work with what they can see. But what we definitely worked with, and I agree with you, with the short-term patient anyway, you don't have the time, because I've also done psychoanalytic training, which is fascinating. But what I was focusing on was the physical effects of anxiety and learning to really manage those feelings and not feeling that anxiety in the same way, and learning to be relaxed and also interpreting situations accurately. I remember having one woman who was in my office, and she said, I'm having a panic attack now. And I said, well, tell me what you're feeling. Well, my heart rate is, very high, and I'm breathing fast and all of this. And I said, well, how did you get here? And she said, well, I walked. And so I said, oh, okay, so you walked up the hill to the hospital? And she said, yes. And I said, you know why your heart's beating? Because you just walked up the hill. It's a physical demand. But then she was interpreting that heart rate as meaning she was anxious and panicky. And it was not actually the case. So sometimes it's reinterpretation of symptoms can be helpful also.
I was going to say, it's interesting that you were bringing the patient back to present, and that was what you were doing because of the parallel with neuroptimal.
Right. Yes, it's a very good point. Because the thoughts can just go off at a tangent, and your mind believes those thoughts. They think they're real. Well, of course, they're not necessarily.
So unless there's other stories you want to dive into with your private practice or with Stony Brook, I think we're sort of, if we're going chronologically, we're sort of at the point where you had your private practice and then you started, and that turned to almost exclusively neurofeedback, right?
It did over time. But by that time, I was not working with any managed care companies because they didn't cover neurofeedback.
Can you say that as a whole statement, as a self-contained statement, like that about the transition?
Over time, my
Yes.
practice became
Right.
fully neuro.
Yes.
And from there, if you just move forward chronologically, and if you want some sort of spark for something, just pause and
Okay.
okay.
Yes, so I was working in my private practice and I found more and more that I was doing less and less psychotherapy, which I missed because I really enjoyed that aspect of working. But I was hooking people up more and more, but that was not compatible with the managed care companies. They wouldn't accept neurofeedback as a treatment. So bit by bit I had to divest myself from those companies and I was just fee for service. So my practice got smaller at that period of time. By this time, I had met Val. I would do consultations with him every so often, or more likely, he would phone me and say, I'm going to do a consultation with somebody in New York City. You know, do you want to do a consultation? I would say yes. So then we'd meet and we'd work with whatever system I was working with at the time. Bit by bit, I guess then we actually, if you want to know how we got together personally, he arrived one day, actually shortly after, was that? Oh no, yes, it was around that time my daughter also moved back into the house in Port Jefferson with her cousin, my niece. So we were sort of fairly full household then. And Val was coming to do a consultation, and I remember complaining that, oh, you know, Val's coming, Val's a great guy, but it kind of interfered with my social life, that I would have to entertain him for the weekend. Anyway, on that particular consultation, I went up to meet him off the train, and he had a rose in his hand. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. And he arrived with a rose and clearly was interested in maybe having a relationship. He and his wife had separated. So I can't remember all the order of events then. I think he actually ended up moving into my house the same day that Samantha and her niece, her cousin, arrived. So we were a very full household then. So Val and I got together in 76, 75 or 76, it must have been 76.
Not 70, 90?
Oh, 96.
We
Sorry.
got married in '98, and Lydia
Okay.
and I went there at the
Yes.
summer of '96.
Okay, so Val and I got together in 96, and very quickly we had decided, without much discussion, that we wanted to establish an institute of health, the two of us together. We decided that within a week. So I registered Zengar as a DBA in New York at the time. Both of us were seeing clients at one time. So I was still sort of doing a bit of psychotherapy with people, and we would work as a couple with the patients. Now that's not very cost-effective way of working, but it was certainly fun, and we worked together very well in that way. But Val's training as a psychologist is completely different than mine. Mine is behaviorism, and his is sort of phenomenology and understanding of language. It's just very different approaches to psychology. But we established Zengar at the time. Zengar Institute, Rhythms for Living was the full name. And it was where we combined cutting-edge technologies with time-honored practices for health and well-being, because he was also going to teach yoga and sort of older stuff like that. We both worked on this CAP scan system, which is the system I started on. And then I got interested in the Othma's system, EEG spectrum, and I wanted to learn how to use that. Now, it wasn't really compatible with Val's 5-phase model. When I first met Val, it was at a time when I noticed the neurofeedback field, and that was in that first conference. I learned that there were very disparate ways of working. There were some people working with sort of ADD using SMR and beta, and that was it. And then there were other people working with alpha and theta, sort of in changing states of consciousness. And I always say they tended to be sort of found more in university basements, doing that kind of consciousness exploration. And the two types of working never came together, and I noticed that there was no overarching theory about how neurofeedback worked. But Val's approach, his 5-phase model, really made sense to me, because every patient who came in, or client, we would like to say, you work in a sequential way, going through all of the known frequencies that were used at that time until they were better. And that made sense to me. It was more comprehensive than what other people were doing and didn't require diagnosis. You didn't have to spend a lot of time evaluating a client. When you're evaluating a client, they're not getting anything for that. They're not getting better during that evaluation, so that's money spent where they're not being helped. And Val's approach didn't require any of that, so it really made sense to me. So when we got together, he was teaching how to work with the 5-phase model. That was his bread and butter. And then I decided I wanted to learn what the Othmas were doing, which was sort of an anathema to what Val was doing. So at the time, it took a bit of courage to go out and do something different from what Val was doing and what he was earning his living at. I felt it was, I was sort of betraying his approach, but I was curious. I wanted to know what other people in the field were doing, not just what I already knew. So I bought the Othma system and learned that, completely what they were doing. And in fact, they asked us to teach their Alpha Theta course at that time, so we were teaching for the Othmas. And in the end, we organized a conference for them in our little village in Port Jefferson, and that was the biggest conference that they had ever done. It went really, really well. But I knew also I wasn't going to stay with that approach. It was very limited by my view. Sue Othma would say that she would take about 5 hours at least. She would get all medical records sent to her. She would spend 5 hours evaluating the client before they even started. And then what was kind of strange to me was the smallness of the toolbox that they had. Then you would work with SMR and beta, and it was very piecemeal. And you could be increasing one frequency and decreasing something else that was actually the worst thing to do for the other diagnosis this one client had, which needed an opposite treatment. So it was very piecemeal. You would work, you would try to avoid side effects during the session, and then you were evaluating when they came back, how their week had gone, and then moderating what you did based on that, and then hoping that you were right this time and wouldn't send them off into a tizzy. And it was important because I was dealing with some people who were pretty sick. They had seizures. They had things that you don't want to aggravate if you can't, if you can help it. It was important to get it right. But I felt I learned a lot, but I also saw that it was just too small a sandbox for me to play in, really. And I asked them to buy back my system, and I said I'd like to sell it back to you rather than me sell it publicly, because I didn't want it known. I didn't want to do them a disservice. that people were seeing that I was stepping off that bandwagon. And that was actually the time when their company started to go downhill, and it went bankrupt pretty soon after. But then I was working with Val's 5-phase model, but then found that I could speed up. I started playing with it because I knew I had a very safe tool to play with, but I was lateralizing instead of always working with CZ. And I was, seeing how I could make what he was doing faster and stronger. And I think that was also impelled a bit by the fact that we had, fewer sessions to work with clients. It became very important how speedily you could work with people. And most of the neurofeedback systems require, for some problems, 60 sessions, 100 sessions. It's a lot of sessions. And I felt I could do better than that. And because Val's 5-phase model was relatively safe, I felt comfortable playing with it. We wanted...
Can you walk through the 5-phase model very briefly and sort of explain how you would integrate it into neurofeedback, into training?
Well, and
also maybe what system you used or how you did it or what your approach was.
well, Val's 5-phase model, actually, he's probably better able to explain it, but you're increasing SMR and increasing beta and decreasing... in Val's model, you're decreasing 3 hertz. Now, that was really, really crucial because, as he said, trauma was held in 3 hertz and in 5 hertz. So the emotional reactivity is in 3 hertz and the cognitive reactivity is in 5 hertz. So we wanted to suppress 3 hertz. And my experience with a CAT scan showed he was absolutely right. If you just suppressed 3 and 5 hertz, you got a lot of improvement because instead of the energy all going into those big slow frequencies, now there was energy available to go further up the frequency bands. So just doing that alone was really crucial. Other systems, however, like the Othmas, suppressed 4 to 7 hertz. They completely bypassed 3 hertz. So you were doing work with them, but sometimes creating a trauma response because 3 hertz was just pumping away. It wasn't suppressed at all. It was allowed to run loose, and that can cause a lot of problems. So then we asked the Othmas for a special set of band filters that would suppress 3 to 6 rather than 4 to 7. So they made us a set, but then we shifted to Biograph by Thought Technology in Montreal, and that's a whole sort of other story. But there we created screens where we could really see what was happening in every frequency bandwidth, and I could watch carefully what was happening, and if something was pumping out, I could shift what I was doing. This was a very different way of working. All the other systems we had, you had to decide ahead what you were going to suppress and what you were going to augment, put that into the program, and then start running. If you wanted to change what you were doing, you had to stop the training, go out of that program, go into another program, adjust the filters, and then go back and start up again. Also, you were moving from left to right, but it was sequential. And that leads into a whole different story once we got into the thought technology system of Biograph and had created these screens to work. How we were at a Biograph at the Future Health Conference at the Biograph stand with Hal Myers, who I knew. He's from Montreal as well. And as a joke, I said to Val, why don't you hook me up? Because they offered a 2-channel system, not 1 channel. So where I was using 1 channel to first work on one side and then shift over to the other, 2 channels, we could do both at the same time. But that wasn't ever done. So I just said to Val as a joke, why don't you hook me up and let's just see if we can train both beta and SMR at the same time. Now that was a really crazy statement because SMR is a very distinct state. I call it the cat frequency. It's a state of great bodily stillness and quiet. It's the cat sort of closing its eyes, and you think it's asleep, but if something runs in front of it, it's on it in a second. So you're aware of what's going on around you, but you're not having any thoughts about it, and you're very bodily still. Beta just takes you up a bit, and it's a very hard frequency, and it's narrow focus of attention. So with the SMR, you're sort of aware of what's going on around you, and the beta just pulls you into this focused attention. They're two different states, so how could you possibly train them at the same time? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, he did that, and it worked. And I thought, well, this is interesting. You can train two states at once. You're getting twice as much for your money, and twice as far, twice as quickly. This is good.
Was it one side, one the other?
That's right,
Okay.
at the same time, rather than having to move sequentially. So then we started designing screens so that I could work with clients, see what was going on, do two things at once, and I would shift. I would still go through his major sort of phases, but by this time I was doing 3 different phases. And Val's theoretical thinking, so all of this, from when I started with the Othmas and then coming back to this point, it was about a period of 2 years. And Val's thinking had become nonlinear dynamical. And what we found was that the way he was thinking was describing actually what I was doing. So the practical work, and the theoretical work were going on sort of separately, but came together to where we created these 3 screens that we could work with, and we worked through the screens sequentially, but doing more than one thing at a time in each of those phases, and we called that the period 3 model. So by that time, we were creating period 3 screens for the biograph, and Val was teaching on those, and we were selling those screens to people who wanted to do that work. So we were sort of thinking of our model, but the technology wasn't there yet. We then decided to ask Hal Myers if he would be willing for us to work with him to create a new and better software, we thought, that could be more effective, and especially for applying this period 3 model. And could Val, develop a software with him? And I remember he phoned me. We wanted this to happen so much, And Hal phoned me, because we knew each other, we were friends, and he said, can Val do it? Can he actually do and create a program? Can he do the programming? And I had to say to him, I don't know, because I didn't know. Can he? I don't know. So I was honest, and Hal decided not to go ahead with that. So, long story short, we decided to start our own software where we could have the filters that we want and work in the way that this more comprehensive way with clients.
And the seed that will become your optimal was so.
Very much so, yes. And that's when I really started to play, because once we sort of developed our program, it was very safe. We were still getting side effects from certain frequencies, but it would balance off with other frequencies. And I could see what was going on by watching these 1 Hertz bins very closely. So the advantage there was I could see if something was going a bit awry before the client felt anything. They weren't aware of it. And then I could shift what I was doing to counteract that and, balance it out without the client even knowing.
This was the software that you developed at the time.
Yes, and we were doing the period 3 model. So we were doing SMR and beta, then we were doing 21, and then we were doing, I can't even remember the order now, 21 and 40 hertz, and we were doing alpha theta. The alpha theta may have been in the middle. So there were 3 distinct phases. And then I asked Val, could he make me a screen with all of those 3 phases on it at once, which he did. And then I started thinking, I wonder if I could just shift from one phase to the other, not even tell the client, because at the time everybody thought it's conscious efforting that's making the changes. If I don't tell the client, I wonder if I shift from one thing to another, if they'll know, if their brain can cope with that without my saying to them, now we're doing this. So behind the scenes, I would shift from one state to another. The only difference was with the alpha theta, we did like to lay them down, give them a blankie, maybe a mask, so it was a distinct state unto itself, and they would know when they were in that. But I found I could shift the states, and the brain could respond absolutely perfectly without any instruction at all. The whole process is clearly outside of the conscious mind. We also developed our thresholds. Instead of saying you have to be over something or under something, we created a box where as long as you're in the box, you're good. And if you go over the box, you're not good. If it's a suppress, if you want to keep it down, they go outside the box above it, that was out. And if you're trying to suppress, augment something and they drop below, then that wasn't right. And then the advantage of the box thresholds was you could play with them and you could move the box thresholds, challenging the system to kind of keep up with you. And if you did that over a few iterations, like 6 iterations, all of a sudden the frequencies that you want less of would suddenly shoot up and then shoot way down and settle to a new lower level. It was like we were, actually at that time we didn't have the box thresholds, we had a line threshold, and you'd move the line. And we found it had a releasing effect. It was set, it would sort of undo that stuckness, as it were, and it would drop to a new lower level. Or if you wanted more of that frequency and you danced with it like that, it would unleash, it would drop down, and then it would shoot up to a higher level. So this all had an unleashing effect, and to effect that, we created the box thresholds. I mean, it's all so long ago now, it's difficult. I'd have to refer to my own article on the history of neurooptimal to really remember the sequence of events. But each thing was a big thing in its way and quite revolutionary. So we could release the stucknesses using this dynamical thresholding, which is not the same as dynamic thresholding, where it's going along in a linear fashion and then the brain drops down here, so that dynamic threshold after 30 seconds or whatever drops down to create a different level of challenge for the person. A dynamical threshold has this active unleashing effect on the frequencies it's working with.
Was it the introduction of 2 thresholds, an upper and a lower threshold, hence the box? Was that the big difference from its predecessor?
It was like a sandbox that you can play in, and as long as you're in the sandbox, you're okay. And if you're outside the sandbox, you're not. But originally, we had bought into the same linear thinking that if you want more of a frequency, that if you were above the box, it was all right. So our first earlier screens, it would, the music would still play. It would only be if it sort of dropped below. And the reverse, the opposite for augments and suppresses. I don't know if that makes sense. It just seemed intuitively that should be all right. If you want more of something, you don't want to say it's bad to be more outside the box above it.
So they had one threshold, so it was working more to suppressing frequencies rather than augmenting.
It was doing both. It was all, we worked the same way with augments and suppresses.
You
But
choose
we-
which
we-
the threshold was to do.
Yes. Yes, and typically the augment thresholds were much smaller amplitudes to work with, so there were smaller boxes, and the suppressors were bigger because they would shoot out a lot more. But one day I remember saying to Val, and I'm cutting a lot of corners out, you know, and telling you it in this way. I remember saying to Val, you know, if we are really going to do the, you know, nonlinear dynamical approach, if you are above the box for an augment, that should be out. That's wrong. It doesn't matter whether you're above it or below it. You have to be in the box for both suppressors and augments. So up till that point, by augmenting and telling or indicating to a frequency that we want more of you or another frequency that we want less, we were actually training states of awareness, and they were distinct states. You know, alpha is a distinct state from SMR, which is a distinct state from the beta, and so forth. Once we let go of the being above or below the box as correct, you had to be in the box, whether it's an augment or a suppress. The difference between augments and suppresses disappeared. We were no longer training states, so you couldn't feel it in the same way. But theoretically, if we were right, this should work. And I remember that first week, it was really distressing to me because I can feel what the client's nervous system is doing, just because I've been mirroring them for so many years. And that's how I was able to make adjustments in the software so easily, because I could feel the effects of what I was doing. I didn't have to wait till next week to find out if they were okay or not. I couldn't feel anything. We weren't pushing them into states anymore. So it felt all very vague. I couldn't guarantee that it was going to work, and here I was working with my clients. But I worked with people I knew very well. And lo and behold, we just found it really powerful, and we were no longer having any side effects that you get from training of states. You know, if you do a lot of 40 hertz, you're going to feel that. And you can do too much. Now, we were avoiding all of that and no longer having any side effects from state training, and yet we were getting powerful unleashing and transformation. But it took some courage to do it, because I was very good at playing with the states and, you know, taking people into deep states and then bringing them back and bringing them into land in a good state for every day. And I had to let all of that go. Now we still do that to some extent with our Zen modes, which we don't even talk about now, but behind the scenes they're running, where they are different, not states, but they do feel differently and have different functions, and you still are bringing somebody into a good place for everyday awareness. And I don't know if you've noticed it, if you run somebody, they'll really conk out often completely, and then in the last few seconds they'll kind of come to, and that's because of all of that running in the background.
So I find it really interesting that you were using this in your practice, neurofeedback, and you and Val were, you know, counseling people together, like you said, and then you started playing with things because you wanted to work with your clients in the most efficient way possible, and bringing them the most shifts that you felt that you could within that 1 hour span or whatever. So at what point did it go from, I just want to use this on my own clients and just make my life and their life easier, to I want to spread this to the world?
I think my motivation personally was to have something that was effortless and would produce a permanent result. I wasn't personally motivated to get this out to the world. I just wanted to create this healing modality for my clients. Val, however, was a teacher. He is a teacher. You know, if we were all on a desert island together, I would be nursing your wounds and he would be teaching whatever it was. That's his essence. So for him, he wanted to teach about this, and he did. He was very open. He did a lot of presentations. He was the sort of front man, if you like, while I was working with clients in the back. And he was teaching on what we were doing and did presentations on all our observations and what have you. But while he was a leader in the field, he created a lot of antagonism in our more classical colleagues, our colleagues who were working in a more linear, well, they are working in a linear way. And it was a difficult pill for them to swallow. You know, their thing was you need a lot of evaluation of a client, you need to be very, very careful with what you do, you need to track them carefully while you're doing it. It's impossible to do neurofeedback without extensive training. You have to be a skilled practitioner, and that takes years. And here was I at the conferences, at my table, running people I had never met, giving them sessions, or maybe a 15-minute session, not a full long one, without any evaluation at all, and without creating any awful side effects. So it was really undermining what they were saying.
Which was, in a sense, it was a big aspect to their business.
Absolutely, yes. It was taking away what they really believed in, fundamentally believed. Their reality was this, and here we were saying, well, actually, you don't need all that. And they were saying you need to be expert. So there's a field of neurofeedback where you have to be highly trained. They really liked to be part of the medical model. That was the sort of goal, to be sort of physician supervised, if you will. But physicians aren't experts in neurofeedback, but you had to be skilled. So you certainly couldn't send a client home with a system for them to work by themselves. That was a dangerous thing and cannot be done. And our view was that everybody has a right to information about their own brain. You shouldn't have to go through an expert. So even though Val and I were experts and people were coming to us, we were saying you don't need to do that. You know, you can work with this at home because we've made it foolproof and effective. And that was very, very threatening to many of our colleagues. However, I will say that at least 3 of my colleagues, who are very well known in their field, they would come to me for their sessions when I was at the conference, and one of them would come every day to make sure he had sessions with me, and yet they were still espousing that you can't do that. It's interesting. Also, the interesting thing about the work I found was that the next step would just present itself, and then I would think, okay, we've got to do this next. It was like an evolving, alive thing. It was a living thing that was evolving. And in a way, I was just trying to keep up, but the next step just became obvious. And I remember being at one conference, and a different colleague had the booth beside us. And I was looking and I was thinking, it's interesting, he's done the same thing for 25 years. You know, how can he do that? Because I can't keep track of what we're doing. It's constantly evolving. So it fascinated me that you can have one thing that you do for 25 years.
You're saying what he did as a profession, he did for
Well,
25 years,
he
or his approach to neurofeedback?
His approach had been the same for 25 years. And he had trained, you know, people in the military, and he promoted himself very effectively. But
so this was in the 90s, right?
In the 2000s.
So
In the 2000s.
in the in the late 70s or 80s, that's when he would have determined his approach and would have held on to it from that time.
I don't know if it would have been as early as the 70s, but he had been in the field offering this approach all this time, and I was just fascinated how it wasn't evolving and changing, because it was very obvious to me that ours was. Now we've got it to where, it's not constantly evolving now because it's very complete. But I just found that curious, because it was so different from my experience with what we were doing.
Right, hard to believe you got it right way back then, and didn't do anything to improve on it.
Another time I remember another one of our colleagues was offering $50 to anybody who could go into this particular state and hold it for a minute or whatever it was, a minute or 2 minutes. So people were trying to do it. It was like a competition and bringing people, I guess, to the stand and all of that. And people in the early days, they didn't know who I was particularly. Val was the front man, so everybody knew Val. But people didn't know who I was. So I'd be in the elevator and I'd hear people talking about Val Brown. They didn't know who I was. And in this instance, I said, I'll try your state. It's, and this is the thing that he promotes. It's one state and there's a sensor on the forehead. And this state is sort of the be-all and end-all. So I put the thing on. I said, okay, I'll do the challenge. And I sort of played around a bit until I found what it was looking for, because it would give the feedback. And then I just went in there and I sat there and I sat there and I sat there. And I could hear him saying, she's done this before. And then he said, there must be something wrong. And he was down under the table, trying to check all his hookups and connections and things, because this was just not possible. Anyway, I sat there for about 5 minutes, I think it was, and in the end I had to stop, and I got a headache from it afterwards, but I never got my $50.
Is this, because I know that, through training with Neuroptimal, one of the things that I've learned along the way is that Neuroptimal doesn't push you into states, but it
Right.
allows you to go into states on an as-needed basis. So depending on what life is throwing at you, you can easily get into whatever you need to get into.
Right.
Would you attribute that to that?
Well, what I attributed it to is that we had to go through all the state stuff, and I was very skilled in all the different states because I trained.
Can you say this, the whole thing, what I attribute it to? Can you say lead up to it? Because we're not here.
Would I attribute my ability to get into
Oh,
a
we're not
state?
going to hear your questions?
Probably not.
Okay. So the ability to go into any state after you've done neuroptimal training is really because we're unleashing your access to all the different states and naturally reducing all the heavy emphasis on the lower frequencies. Because it turned out that in the early days when we were trying to augment some frequencies and trying to suppress other frequencies, we were actually right, because that is what the healthy brain does. It does produce more of this and less of this. So we were on the right track, but we thought we had to sort of push it and force it, but we don't. So what we do now, we do our training, it unleashes the points of stuckness, and so less energy is going on the ocean floor, as I call it, because when you're looking at a sort of diagram and seeing all the colors of where the energy is going, it's got complete blank and then this bright thing on the bottom, and then bit by bit that breaks up and you see colors starting to go further up until in the end you have a whole array of energy all over throughout the frequency ranges, and our frequencies went up much higher than people said. You can't train higher than 18 hertz because you have muscle artifact interfering with that. And I was routinely training at 42 hertz. So we were offering a lot more. So once you have access to all of these frequencies, whatever state you need to go in, you can just go into easily, whatever state you need for whatever you're doing, whether it's meditating, driving, interacting with your friends and loved ones, it doesn't matter. But how we got there by going through all the state training. So I knew the state of SMR very well. I knew the state of beta very well. I knew all of the states. And we can talk at a different time maybe about the different frequency states. That we were working with many more frequencies than other people, to great utility. Again, that we have certain frequencies that have an effect on all the other frequencies. They're not just frequencies themselves, but they have an effect on the whole spectrum. So now, yes, we don't train states, but you get access to everything that you need. But I can go into states because of my early work. We did train states, and I knew those states very well.
So sort of like a subtracted equalization, the brain activity, brain frequency.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but it sounds right, that you're subtracting from the lower frequencies and equalizing all the way up.
Taking away something that's inhibiting something else, so like subtracting something and then it allows other stuff to come up naturally.
That's in a way, if you're talking about the lower frequencies, yes, because that takes a lot of energy, and once you don't put energy there, then you've got it more usefully going all the way up. But these other frequencies that I'm talking about, and I don't know if you want to go into those now, as part of that period 3, I discovered that certain frequencies had this salubrious effect on the whole spectrum, one in one direction, bringing everything tighter and more controlled, and the other releasing and, letting everything go. And I could balance those off to break up patterns of behavior. Now, you don't have to think about any of that today. You just run a session, and it's all going on in the background.
Is there any more, because I mean, we were keeping them separate for their personal histories, but I feel like we're kind of touching on enough software stuff that it might make sense to bring
Yeah, we
about
can,
in now.
let's see, that was an hour 20 roughly. How are you feeling?
3 o'clock right now.
I'm okay. So if you're asking a question, I really should sort of repeat it in a way, and I'm assuming they can hear, and you're part of the interview.
You should repeat it, assuming, try to make it self-contained as much as possible. Because it's going to be out of context, whatever is taken, so it just gives better opportunity to use it in the future.
Okay. Well, should we take a break?
Is there anything more
5
that
minute
you want to
break.
say about your past?
Would you like to go into other stuff? Like what are you feeling right now? Like because we could break now, and either you can come back and go more on your own, or we could bring Val in.
Bring Val in, and
Okay,
we'll
so
go wherever you want to go.
you're comfortable with what you talked about and
Yes, I
your
think so.
personal history?
I think so.
Okay.
Are we still recording?
Yeah.
How do you think when you were younger, your parents told you that essentially, you couldn't do anything. How do you think they would feel now about where you've come?
I mean, it's interesting because I was always expected to achieve, but I wasn't allowed to really use that. My father was very hot on me doing well academically, but then I couldn't use it for anything. I had to go and be a nurse. I did A-levels in Britain, and you needed A-levels to go to Barts, but to be a nurse generally, you didn't need A-levels. You could stop at O-levels. It was not an academic endeavor at the time. But how would I think that my parents would feel today? I know how my mother felt. She certainly, because you're female, what you say is just worth less than if you're a male. So she would ask other people, even though I was the boss of that other person, and she would lay more stock in what that person said than in what I said. And she did tell me once, she said, your father taught you to think like a man. So if I achieved, I was actually behaving like a man. I wasn't being feminine. So I remember while I was studying, becoming aware of almost like the feeling that I shouldn't be doing this, I can't be better than my parents. And it was a strong pull, and I had to consciously keep going despite it. And then eventually that was in the rearview mirror and I was off. But there's definitely a pull not to... I suppose you're designed to please your parents. That's the best avenue for survival, right? And it wasn't really... My father knew I had been accepted into the PhD program, but he never said anything about it. It wasn't like, as far as I know, I don't know that he was proud of me. I think he would have just thought that was odd, given that I was a girl. And I hadn't done so well at school when I was young because I was constantly being pulled out and then into another place in another part of the world or another country. So I had no sort of sequence of anything, and my focus was on the social aspects, getting accepted into this new environment as quickly as possible. It wasn't focused on the academic. It was only much later that I realized I really enjoyed studying and I was good at it. I didn't know that before. But I think it fitted my father's and my mother's vision that as a female, you're not going to be very good anyway, and it doesn't much matter. But I was still banished if I didn't do well. So it was all a mixed message, I imagine.
You should achieve but not thrive, maybe.
You should achieve, but you're not going to actually use that. To be a physician would have been unheard of for them. In fact, much later, I said to my father when I was about 17, I think I'd like to do medicine rather than nursing. And he said, you can't, you won't, it'll be a waste. And he said, I won't support you doing that. And you can't do it without me. That's what he told me.
Was that a stereotype shared by their generation, you think? Or
Yes, I think so. I think it was partially them. My mother was a very sort of passive female, and that was an interesting road, learning to be a woman that was a different kind of woman than my mother was. But yes, there were certainly products of their generation.
Was your father's response financially motivated, thinking, well, I'm not going to pay for you to go to med school because you're going to end up staying home and raising children anyway? Is that sort of...
I think so, yes. I think it was that if I invest in you, it's going to be wasted. He said it'll be a waste. He didn't say it was financial, but it'll be a waste, and I won't support you in doing that, and you can't do it without my support.
Well, you showed him.
I did. I did.
Sorry, I want to squeeze that one in because it's completely Sue related.
Right, and girls could probably relate to it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he was proud. Are we good?
Yeah.
Yeah.